All right, good afternoon. It's 1 o'clock on Wednesday, which means it's time for an Iowa Learning Farms conservation webinar. I'm Matt Helmers with Iowa State University. The Iowa Learning Farms is a partnership of Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, Iowa DNR, Iowa NRCS, and Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. So really happy to be able to moderate today. And I think we have a really important and timely topic. We have with us Dr. Alejandro Plastina, that was a former colleague of mine at Iowa State University until he left to go to the University of Missouri. But we're happy that he's still willing to give a webinar and he's still working in this space. Dr. Plastina is Center Director at the Rural and Farm Finance Policy Analysis Center. And he's going to talk to us today about adoption and disadoption of soil and water management practices in the U.S. So with that, the virtual floor is all yours, Dr. Plastina. And as always, if you have questions, please type those in the chat box and we'll get those to Alejandro at the end of his talk.
Thank you very much, Matt. And it's great to be back in Iowa, and although virtually doing this presentation. Hopefully we can have several comments about this presentation and some conversation at the end. So I just want to introduce the topic by going to this very commonplace, the principles of soil health, and how important these principles are for soil health management. I think most everybody in this audience will be very familiar with maximizing biodiversity, soil cover, living roots, and minimizing disturbance in order to increase soil health in agriculture, right? I'm using this slide from our colleague Marshall McDaniel, and I appreciate him sharing with me this slide because it shows how those theoretical concepts from the previous slide really resonate with a number of practices. So providing soil armor or minimizing soil disturbance, well, both cover crops and residue management can help with that. Minimizing soil disturbance, well, of course, reduced tillage can help with that. No-till also, of course. And then biodiversity, maximizing biodiversity means increasing plant diversity and integrating livestock to the extent possible, in which in both cases cover crops can help with those goals. And finally, maximizing root system throughout the year. Of course, cover crops can help. And then when we talk about minimizing soil disturbance, of course, the main practice there is reduced tillage and no-till. And for soil armor, well, providing residue that comes with some reduced tillage management. So all this to say that we will focus on cover crops and no-till or reduced tillage in the rest of the presentation, because those are two major practices to help with soil health management. Now, I'm an economist and would like to think in terms of benefits and costs, right? And not only benefits and costs to the farmer, which are the private benefits, but also benefits and costs to the society or public benefits and costs. So this slide is from a very recent report published by the Economic Research Service and lists the most typically discussed benefits and costs for soil health management practices. In particular, when we think of private benefits, we think of revenue increasing or cost decreasing practices for farmers. So what are those? What are the findings associated with private benefits from the literature? Well, the literature finds that in some cases there's increased yields or decreased yield variability associated with these soil health management practices. In some cases there's decreased input costs, particularly less fertilizer with legume cover crops, or fuel expenses with conservation tillage. If livestock is integrated into the system, then there are cost savings, or there might be cost savings from grazing or harvesting the biomass from cover crops. There's usually reduced soil erosion and decreased soil compaction with both practices. And there might be some improved nutrient use efficiency or reduced nutrient loss. Those are findings from the literature related to the private benefits, the potential private benefits in particular. Now, if we go to the findings in the literature related to potential private costs that offset the net returns of these practices for farmers, this report summarizes that, well, some reports, some research indicates that adopting these practices might result in lower average yields or increased yield variability, particularly from cover crops, additional fixed costs related to implement use or new equipment. There might be increased input costs, of course, cover crop seeds, herbicide costs for no-till management, and cover crop termination are examples of those increased input costs. There might be opportunity costs related to planting cover crops instead of a cash crop and forfeiting the double cropping benefit when that's feasible. But even if that's not the case, just the additional management time by the farmer is an opportunity cost that is associated with adopting new practices. Cover crops may attract unwanted wildlife or pests, and adding field operations may affect fieldwork scheduling and increase labor costs for the entire operation. So the research provides mixed results, right, in terms of potential private benefits and potential private costs. This report also looks into the findings related to public benefits and public costs. So on the public benefits side, there's potential to have reduced pest and disease outbreak incidence due to beneficial insects or reduction in herbicide-resistant weeds over time. There might be the public benefit of reduced soil erosion, improving air and water quality down the road. There might be carbon sequestration associated with these soil health management practices. Reduced nutrient loss or improved pesticide management improves water quality. Increased soil infiltration or water holding capacity could mitigate effects of extreme precipitation events, and these practices could increase biodiversity. On the other side of this chart in red, the report also lists potential public costs associated with these practices, and they are decreased yield or increased yield variability. Could have public costs in terms of federal programs. Think of higher costs to maintain the crop insurance, the federally sponsored crop insurance program, for example. Increased pests or disease incidents for neighbors due to cover crops being a possible host for those pests could be a public cost. And then there's a recommendation that practices and management systems must be evaluated for environmental trade-offs, right? So these in general can increase the public costs of providing assistance to implement these soil health management practices. In terms of adoption, those are the causes and the economic explanation of what variables are playing in the background, at least how we understand the literature, the existing literature, and around those variables. But another question is, what's the level of adoption of these practices? And based on US data, a team of colleagues and I developed these estimates as cover crop adoption as a percent of cropland by county from the U.S. Census of Agriculture, the 2022 census, and a similar calculation for no-till area by county as a percent of cropland. And we can see that on the left in green, the darker the green, the higher the percent of cropland area in cover crops. Across the nation, the green is not too dark, right? Across the US, on average, 4.7% of the cropland area adopted cover crops as of 2022. In Iowa, that percent was 5%, a little bit higher. And most of the most intensive adoption did not occur in the Midwest, but around the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland and surrounding areas. Now, on the no-till side, the darker the color, the more intensive the adoption. There's a clear pattern that goes across the nation, right, in darker colors. So on average, we have that for the entire nation, about 27.5% of all cropland adopted cover crops in 2022. For Iowa, that percentage was higher, about 33%. But in both graphs, you see the spatial variability in terms of adoption. This is not the same level of adoption for all counties or even within the state. There are major variations in intensity of adoption within Iowa, for example. Another way to look at this question of adoption rates can be addressed by looking at survey data instead of census data. So colleagues at the Economic Research Survey, using data from ARMS, a farm-level data set, very rigorously collected, they estimated different levels of adoption, also as a percent of acreage by crops. And I would like to point your attention to the orange area for reduced tillage and no-till for corn, for example. That's close to 40% reduced tillage area across the nation, according to their estimates, much higher than our estimate from the US Census. And for no-till, almost 36% of all US corn area was estimated to be in a no-till management by 2021. For cover crops, that percent was much lower, 8.4%, again for corn, but still much higher than what we estimated using census data. Now for soybeans, that's an estimate conducted in 2023. Again, we have much higher adoption rates for reduced tillage, almost 36%, and no-till, almost 45%, compared to cover crops, 11.1%. With this much richer data set, they are able to look at the interaction of different practices. So I want to bring your attention to the percent of no-till acres with cover crops. So out of these 36% in corn, 36% of corn acres in no-till systems, well, 14.3% have had cover crops by 2021. That number is about 17% for soybeans. So there's a big, or I would say, a substantial interaction with those two practices, between those two practices. And of course, just like in the previous slide, we talk about the spatial variability. This chart or this table provides solid evidence of substantial variability across crops too. Another question that can be raised is not just how much adoption there's at the point in time, but how adoption changed between 2 points in time, right? So are these soil and water management practices expanding in area or not? Well, these two maps show percentage changes between 2017 and 2022 from the US Census of Agriculture in terms of cover cropped area in those years on the left, and in terms of no-till area as a percent of all cropland area on the right. And let's start at the bottom with those little tables. Cover crops, cover crop area increased from 3.9% in 2017 to 4.7% in 2022 for the US as an aggregate. And for Iowa, the increase was even larger, from 3.7% of the cropland area to 5%. So there was an increase in the total, but when we look at the percent change by county, there's even larger heterogeneity than what we saw in the previous slides, right? Areas in blue indicate counties where there was a disadoption of cover crops. So where the adoption of cover crops in 2022 was lower than the adoption in 2017. And you can see there are plenty of counties in blue on the left. Fortunately, not too many in Iowa, but again, there's a lot of blue. That means that there has been a big disadoption, although on the aggregate, adoption of cover crops increased between those two censuses. Well, many counties disadopted cover crops. On the right, when we look at no-till, there's less blue. That means that there's less disadoption, but many counties also disadopted. Although at the aggregate level, US no-till area increased from 26.4% to 27.5% over this period. And in Iowa, that percent increased also from 30.9% to 32.7%. Now, the USDA Economic Research Service also used the censuses of agriculture in 2012, 2017, and 2022 to analyze the share of US operations. So these are farms, not acreage. The US, the share of US farms or operations that with cropland that used cover crops in the 3 years, in 2 years, or only in 1 year. And this chart shows that cover crop adoption is increasing, but many producers do not continue cover cropping through time. Only 3.4% of all the operations in the censuses had some cover crop area in the 3 years. 2.5% had in cover crop in 2012 and 2017, and only 1.3% had cover crops in 2012 and 2022, but not in 2017. And there was a large share of operations who had cover crops only in one of those 3 years. When we look at the same report, trying to find more localized data for Iowa, well, the best we can do from that report is look at the Heartland region, which is the area highlighted in yellow in this little map, and of course that includes Iowa, Illinois, and the Indiana, parts of Missouri, and so on. But in this chart, we see pretty much the same. Only a small fraction of all adopters in any year of all the operations with some cover crop in any given year maintain their cover crop through time, at least across these 3 points in time. I would like to bring up a summary of the available studies out there. This again was conducted by the Economic Research Service, and the table is organized with the theme, the main papers or studies around that theme, and then the major conclusions or ideas on the right. So I will talk about the theme and the major ideas within key themes, but will not mention the key studies. You can look at them as we go. So for reduced tillage intensity, that might reduce input costs, but net profitability varies. And the major ideas behind that research topic is that lower tillage intensity can lead to reduced input costs in labor, machinery, and fuel, but estimated yield effects of no-till and reduced tillage are variable. In terms of the short-term returns to adopting cover crops, which are often negative, well, the findings indicate that cover cropping increases input cost, typically seed planting and terminating cover crops. And then they might lead to yield losses in the short run, but profits are expected to be more positive or less negative if some grazing of livestock takes place in the field, or there are benefits regarding soil compaction. Another major topic are the economic outcomes of soil health practices, which are dynamic, and that they occur through time. And in that sense, the profitability of practices such as cover crops may increase over time. The literature is mixed about long-term profitability of cover cropping, and the long-term profits depend substantially on assumptions about the discounting of future benefits. And estimates of producer discounting are wildly different across studies. Risk and uncertainty impact producer adoption of new soil health practices like cover crops because producers are typically risk and ambiguity averse. So they try to avoid practices that generate more variability in yields in the absence of major improvements in other outcomes. And of course, more research on the effects of cover crops on yield and yield risk is needed to improve decision-making for producers. Finally, the profitability of individual practices is impacted by the management system as a whole. And the findings here are that the use of other practices might make a certain practice more profitable if adopted. That means that there's interaction between these practices. So several studies have found complementarities between no-till cover crops and other practices. That's like the large percent, the 14% adoption of cover crops in no-tilled systems, that I showed before. So can we say something about how the adoption of conservation tillage impacts crop yield or production costs? Well, not in a causal matter, not causality. We cannot really discuss causality, but we can discuss correlation or association. Now, that means that it could go, the correlation or the relationship between the variables can go from yield to adoption or from adoption to yield, for example. So this is not causal analysis, but in general, the literature finds that there's a positive correlation between conservation tillage adoption and crop yield. For corn, no significant effect for soybeans. When we talk about correlation between conservation tillage adoption and production costs for corn, that correlation is negative. So the adoption is correlated with decreased cost of production for corn and for soybeans. But we cannot really tell exactly the causality direction. So I will just provide my 2 cents on my own research on net returns to cover crop at Iowa State University. Again, I was a faculty at ISU for a decade, and several projects, including those funded by Iowa State, found that In crop-only Midwestern production systems, cover crops are not profitable for most farmers without cost share payments. Now, even when we account for cost share payments, net returns, of course, are less negative among program participants, but not all participants experience positive profits. And when we mix livestock into the production systems, then cover crops might be profitable under the right conditions. And in order to do that, we use partial budget analysis. And here are a few examples of the research projects that we conducted. In all of them, net returns without cost share and without grazing livestock were negative at a tune of anywhere between $3 per acre to $53 per acre negative. When we add cost share, then some studies showed positive net returns. And when we add grazing livestock from the biomass and cost share, then more studies show positive net returns, although not all of them. And even when we include livestock in the mix, although the average might be close to breaking even, the average net return is closer to breaking even, not everyone would benefit from that, in the sense that not everyone will be able to break even, because that calculation really depends on the amount of biomass produced and the quality of the biomass produced through cover crops. So in our study, only those fields producing more than 2,000 pounds per acre of biomass would generate consistently positive net returns. Now, many discussions end with a criticism to these findings, in the sense that, well, most of these economic studies focus only on the short-term profitability and not the long-term, and all these soil and water management practices are to improve soil health, water quality, and eventually that would translate into higher land value. So monetizing land value would be a way to capture those early investments in those practices through time. But can we really expect that to happen? Based on a study that we conducted with funding from the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, thanks Matt, Practical Farmers of Iowa, and the Iowa chapter of the American Society of Farm Managers and Rural Appraisers, we learned that land is traded on potential productivity indexes like CSR2. The index was developed for tax purposes and is based on land survey data from the 80s. So any information on any improvements on any specific tract of land will not be reflected on the CSR2. And also we learned that the certified general appraisers must follow certain rules of the profession, or they risk losing their certification. Now, those rules do not allow for adjustments in appraised land values based on soil health or soil fertility. And even if it were allowed by just a change of regulations, it's not possible to conduct such an analysis without a database of soil health indicators attached to comparable sales. That's what's used by the appraisers to put a value to a property. So I will conclude this presentation saying that soil and water management practices provide multiple public benefits and they are the justification for government support, but public benefits usually exceed private benefits, and private net returns are not always positive, even when we account for government support, financial and technical support. Now, the overall use of soil and water management practices is increasing, but there is substantial temporary or permanent disadoption across time. And there are hard barriers to monetizing soil health that limit this expansion, in my opinion. So I will stop here and try to address any questions that might have been raised.
Okay, thanks, Alejandro. So maybe we can go through those logistical slides and folks can get additional questions in there. The first one should be if you watch this webinar live and are wanting to earn a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW, at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today, including your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. Again, Elena Whitaker, ALENAW, at iastate.edu. Let's go to the next slide. If you watch this webinar live and are willing to fill out a voluntary demographic survey, we'd greatly appreciate it. You can scan that QR code or go to the address there, iowalearningfarms.org/survey. Only one response is needed for 2025 webinars. So if you've done that, we greatly appreciate it. And if you'd consider it, that would be great as well. We'll put a plug in for the webinar next week so we can go to the next slide. Wenjun Huang will be talking about hidden carbon credits, reducing soil organic carbon erosion with cover crops. So something else related to cover crops. And then next slide is if you know somebody that might like to watch this webinar, these are all archived, or if you want to watch something that you missed a topic from past webinars, you can go, they're archived on the Iowa Learning Farms site, or we have a YouTube channel, Iowa Learning Farms-webinars. Okay, I think that's it. So now we can get to some questions. Maybe the first one is, do you have any data on whether the disadoption was to switch to different BMP practices or return to some more conventional system?
Great question. Unfortunately, there's no such data attached to the Census of Agriculture or the surveys, the RMS survey used by the Economic Research Survey. The Economic Research Service. So we cannot really respond to that, but based on discussions and general understanding of the situation, we believe that the disadoption means that they go back to conventional practices, not a switch to other BMPs.
Okay. Do you have any information that kind of compared EQIP programs between 2017 and 2022? Somebody's wondering whether those programs could have incentivized the increase in adoption or the loss of dollars triggering disadoption.
Great question. So in both cases, based on research that my team and I conducted on EQIP payments, there was an increase in EQIP payments, cost share payments, for both cover crops and no-till between 2017 and 2022. For as far as I can remember, for all counties, I would say most counties, just to err on the safe side. But yes, the EQIP, NRCS calculates the cost of implementing the conservation practice, the additional or the extra or the marginal cost of implementing the conservation practice, and then decides what percent of that additional cost will be paid as cost share to farmers. And those costs went up between 2017 and 2022. So the end payment to the farmer increased between those 2 points. So that could have played a role, certainly.
Okay. There was somebody that noted that in Kansas, they saw a long-term drought from 2019 to 2020, and there were farmers who adopted not to plant those years. Is there any way to tease out any impact in that weather might play in some of this, I guess?
Yes, this is a great question too. Unfortunately, the Census of Agriculture and ARMS data does not provide the richness necessary to do this kind of causal analysis. But yes, we are aware that when there's drought, substantial drought, and there's disadoption of some conservation practices, particularly cover crops, right? So yeah, that was also a factor, particularly in Kansas. But again, we don't have data to prove that.
Yeah. Um, so is there any data on how many farmers that might be using Farm Bill programs continue using cover crops without program support? This
Hmm.
might be outside of your study, this one, but
Yeah, so a number of surveys try to capture that, but they are all very small scale and not representative of
okay,
the any particular state or the U.S. Population of cover crop users.
okay,
So I think um, the logical pathway for cover crop users is to um, using those, particularly those who want to interact with NRCS, is to start with equip, and after the 3 or 5 year contract, then move to CSP for another
yeah,
5 years or so. And after that, well, there will have to be some kind of improvement to the mix of cover crops or
yeah,
an addition of other conservation practices in order to be able to continue to participate in CSP. But I am not aware of any data set tracking the long-term impacts, particularly after the discontinuation of EQIP or CSP payments.
okay, great. And there are kind of a couple questions here about the, disadoption or and then maybe readoption. It, is anybody trying to understand kind of the reasons for disadoption by the farmers?
Not at a
Okay,
large scale. So,
okay,
um, yeah, there are surveys, researchers in different institutions trying to understand this adoption um, causes and, try to understand the entire system. But as far as I know, there's no clear consensus
yeah,
on why they stop and why they will start cover cropping again.
okay, great. Is there again, this is maybe a little outside of this study, but any data that suggests that producers who enroll in cover crop programs are more likely to adopt other management practices?
That's a very interesting question. Well, I think if anything, we can say that those who adopt no-till are more likely to later adopt cover crops. But
Okay,
if they start with cover crops, it's I wouldn't feel comfortable saying that there's a higher chance that they will also adopt
okay,
no-till or reduced tillage,
okay,
because they need different equipment and so on, right? So um, I don't think there has been such a study completed yet.
okay. And then there was somebody that asked uh, if you've conducted any analysis of conservation adoption comparing farmers that own land to farmers that rent land.
Hmm. Um, yes, we tried, and there are many different ways to address this issue. Like farmers, particularly in Iowa, given that around half of the farmland is rented, farmland that is uh, in crop um, in crop production is rented. Most operations own some farmland and they rent the rest. So
Mhm.
it's really hard to tease out the effects of or find farmers that only that their entire operation um, have occurs in on rented land.
Yeah.
But what I would say is that for those that have been surveyed, and I did some of this research myself. Those who participate in our surveys, farmers tend to implement conservation practices on their own land first before moving or trying out implementing the same conservation practices on rented land.
Yeah. Okay. Which makes sense, especially in a way, if they're going to try these things, they can, they don't have to ask the tenant to do it, but they can do it themselves. Yeah.
Exactly, yes. And also the long-term benefits, which are very hard to measure, the long-term benefits accrue to their own land.
Mhm. This is an interesting one that somebody noted that 2025 may have been affected, that may have been one of the years affected by glyphosate shortages, and that this individual remembered growers cutting out cover crops for the issue of termination because of concerns with glyphosate shortages, which is an interesting, which I had
Interesting.
not heard before. Yeah.
I haven't really seen any report or research on this
Okay.
specific issue.
Okay. Great. Well, Alejandro, as always, it's great to hear from you. Really important information, and certainly something we need to think about moving forward is how can we reduce that disadoption of these cover crops or no-till, any conservation practice. We want to keep those on the land, but understanding some of that this disadoption occurs is super important. Um, if folks, again, need a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW, at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today, including your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. With that, Alejandro, I'll give you the last word if you have one.
Thank you very much, Matt, for inviting me. I think what you just said is critical. Focusing on, given the limitation of resources and time to implement these conservation practices at large scale, I think it's as important to focus on continued adoption going forward than trying to convince farmers to start implementing these practices from scratch.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think CSP, if I had to put this in terms of NRCS programs, CSP, in my opinion, should play a bigger role than EQIP going forward.
Okay, great. Now that was great. Great last words. All right. Thank you so much, Alejandro. You have a great day.
You too.